Oh, I guess I can say this now. The Frontrunner, The Life of Steve Prefontaine, published by Mariner Books, is available for pre-order. Oh my gosh, and look at that book cover. You can visit the bookseller of your choice, Powell's, Bookshop.org, HarperCollins, Barnes & Noble, and yes, even Amazon, if that's your thing, and plunk down $32.99, or maybe $65.98 or $98.97. I can keep going. Everything helps. Every author you know under the sun begs for pre-orders, and you only have so many dollars at your disposal, so I'll just say, consider it. Hell, if you order 5 or more, email the receipt to me, and I'll be sure to do like a private book club meeting thing for you and your gang, okay? Okay, but listen. Promotional support for this podcast is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference, celebrating its 26th year on the last weekend of March, the 28th and the 29th. 300 to 400 journalists from around the world descend on Boston, Massachusetts. Keynote speakers include Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, and Dan Zak, and they're coming to deliver the knowledge and the inspiration. If you like this kind of work, and I know you do, listeners of this podcast can get 15% off your enrollment fee by using the code CNF15. To learn more, visit combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code.
Looking at writing the book as not just the desk time. It's also the time when you're walking around, when you're reading, making appointments at archives.
All right. Yes. All right, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. You knew that. But in case you didn't, it's a show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara. I know him. Hope you had a nice holiday, whether you celebrate Christmas or not. It's a nice time to ruminate, to think of the past, to think of the future, to evaluate your path. Stephanie Gorton is here. Second time she's been on the show. This for her new book, The Icon and the Idealist, Margaret Sanger, Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry that brought birth control to America. It's published by Ecco. Stephanie is also the author of Citizen Reporters, and we talked about that back on episode 210. Amazing how the river of the podcast just flows. And before you know it, some 2.5 years have gone by. Stephanie's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Smithsonian, Paris Review Daily, the Boston Globe, and the New Republic. Her book has gotten a ton of great attention, like a full giant review in The New Yorker, the New York Times, and I think the Washington Post and elsewhere. Well-deserved attention on a topic that shouldn't feel as topical as does, basic bodily autonomy and a woman's right to choose whether or not she wants to bear children. Should, I don't know, call me crazy, start and stop with her own agency. Stephanie's book tracks the world where women were mainly seen as childbearing vessels and little else, really. Often delivering a baby once a year, and just this thing of the severe physical, emotional, and financial burden and how hollowed out these husks of women became. She illustrates it brilliantly. Birth control was a revolutionary means of easing the burden, not just on the family, but on the communities that would inherit just child after child after child. The rivalry at the heart of this book is the driving force, and you're left wondering how much faster things could have moved or how much stronger it could have been had Sanger and Dennett teamed up instead of cut each other down. And temperamentally, they were the perfect pair, like a figurehead and a chief of staff. But alas, that didn't happen. Show notes to this episode more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, my little piece of the internet, my little piece of property, my little garden. There you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, a little dispatch where I share cool links, book recommendations, book raffles, happy hour. It's a mini magazine, if you will, about living a more intentional life in the digital space. In this conversation, Stephanie shares lessons on what she learned from writing book 1 to book 2, embracing the messiness, structure, world building, and how she curried favor with the Dennett family. Lots of rich stuff that I know you'll enjoy. I guarantee it, or your money back. Here's Stephanie Gorton. Riff. At what point does like an idea hit you and you're like, oh wow, that seems like something? And then, what's your first move to see if this is something you want to spend several years
Mm,
with?
yes. Yeah, it does have to have some key pieces. In this case, I'd finished a book about a group of journalists in the early 1900s. It was about the muckrakers, Ida Tarbell and SS McClure. This was before Dobbs. I'd finished the book. It was 2019. But I'd started working with an abortion fund here in Rhode Island just as a volunteer. And I found myself really curious about how we got here. So many histories of the reproductive rights movement start with Roe or the few years before Roe. And I found myself wondering, what about birth control? Has that always just been a pillar of health? Has it always been the sign of like frugality and common sense and, taking care of yourself? And of course, it hasn't. It was this radical movement. And I had heard Margaret Sanger's name quite a bit, in various contexts. Like she definitely was more notorious than famous because of her association with the eugenics movement. But I never heard of Mary Ware Dennett. And then finding out, I really like having this, like a relationship at the center of the story. This isn't just
Mm-hmm.
like a kind of hero, a villain, the progression of a movement or of events to like some culminating moment. It's a relationship that drove both of them because they had this, was what was a rivalry. And then you could see that Margaret Sanger's success was really in reaction to, I mean, not fully in reaction to her contest with Dennett, but that it was really shaped by it in some key ways. I thought that was so interesting. So it's a topic I care about. To answer your question, it's a topic I care deeply about personally. I was curious about the history, and then I saw that there was a character and a relationship, Mary Ware Dennett and her relationship with Margaret Sanger. They hadn't been covered. Like there's a great biography of Mary Ware Dennett, came out about 25 years ago, and there are countless biographies of Margaret Sanger. But the story of the birth control movement through their relationship, I thought could be a really interesting book. It also an essential piece is that to write my characters, I love to be able to read through as many of their personal papers as possible. And Dennett had an established archive up at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. So I first went there and I started this research in 2019. So I spent quite a bit of time in that archive, and then institutions closed in 2020 with the start of the COVID pandemic. And I ended up making contact with Dennett's family, with her descendants, and with the curator of the family papers, Sharon Spalding. That opened up a whole nother facet of the story, a whole dimension, because Sharon holds Dennett's personal papers. There were diaries, notebooks, belongings, pieces of artwork. And that kind of, I was already invested in the project, but it became, I still feel very involved with this character, very involved with the book. I almost wish I was still writing it because spending time in that archive was so inspiring. So it's going to be hard to find something to live up to that, I think, in the future.
What were your conversations like with Dennett's family and descendants to get that degree of access? And yeah, just what were those conversations like as you lobbied for that?
It's interesting because it's never a guarantee that a family is going to welcome every writer that comes in. So definitely didn't take that for granted. But I wrote to her kind of just a cold email, and they happened to be really gracious people. And of course, they wanted to know who I was, what kind of work I'd already done, and we started talking. I drove up to visit them. There's a Dennett family homestead in New Hampshire. That's really a pretty magical place to visit. It's an old house. It's an 18th century house. Has a little hidey hole under the stairs where they say it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, actually. And it has so many of Dennett's actual belongings and book collections that are still there. It never felt like I absolutely had to prove myself to them, but there
Yeah.
was like a getting to know you period. I feel so fortunate that the person handling all this material happened to be Sharon Spalding. She's a writer herself. She's a feminist historian. She's brilliant and, provided a lot of guidance and just so much generosity. as I got further along with the research.
In terms of your book writing from Citizen Reporters to this one, I wanted to get a sense of maybe what have you kind of learned from book one to book two, and in what ways have your skills sharpened as a writer and a researcher?
I think what got sharpened is that I kind of got to accept my own messiness and embrace that and work it and assume it and work it into the process. So the first time around, I didn't really make like a research document that was separate from my notes or my working draft. Everything was just in one big Scrivener file. And this time, I realized that I discover sources or I hear about things or I think things up often while I'm walking the dog. And I need to have a grid open all the time where I can just jot down that thing that I intend to target in the future. So, process wise, that helped a lot. I think there is a phenomenon of women in their late 30s, early 40s, being diagnosed with ADHD. And I haven't been through the process myself, but it's almost like seeing those traits and thinking, oh, I'm going to try to use them rather than, scold myself when it turns out my research document is a mess or I miss a source because I haven't taken the time to jot it down or I jotted it down in the wrong place. It's sandwiched between two giant blocks of text and I was never going to find it again after writing it there. That has helped a lot. For book one, I would try to sit and write for like 4 or 5 hours at a stretch and work for that long. And this time I never even tried. If I got 1 or 2 hours at a stretch, that was great. And I try to get a couple of those blocks each day. But just being more looking at writing the book as not just the desk time. It's also the time when you're walking around, when you're reading, making appointments at archives, having interview conversations with people. I mean, talking about working with the family, once you have a positive connection with one person, it doesn't necessarily open everything up there or let you know what you have access to. For me, it took several conversations, and then ultimately Sharon connected me with Dennett's granddaughter, Nancy Dennett, who was then in her 90s and who has since passed away.
Hmm.
But after interviewing her, Nancy on the Zoom screen kind of looked at Sharon and said, yeah, I think you should show her the notebook. And this ended up being Dennett's diary of her love affair with a colleague in 1915, which was a huge year for her. It was the year that she wrote the sex ed manual, The Sex Side of Life, which she wrote for her teenage sons, but ended up getting her indicted under the Comstock Act 15 years later. It was also the year that she launched the National Birth Control League. Just so much was going on in her life. And to get that personal take on what was going on the cafes she ate at, the dresses she wore, what her apartment was like, never mind the romance that was going on, was just phenomenal. But it just took putting in time. It wasn't obviously leading anywhere. So that I think was also something. It was lucky that it turned out that way. But that is kind of my frame of mind now about putting a book together. Like you show up, you put time in, you like run processes down their logical line, and it's not always clear that you're going to have a really fruitful day's work, but just do things like one day at a time and focus in the best way you can, even if it's just for like 20 minutes at a time.
What was your best organizational tool or method that helped you with this your latest book?
It's so boring, but it's probably just this spreadsheet where I had like each kind of source that I was looking for, whether it was an archival source or a documentary or a scholarly book or so on and so forth. And I just had the whole list of everything that I was targeting. And after I finished reading each source, of course, I'd look in the bibliography and add a whole bunch more sources to target to that document. Then I could just kind of like work my way through. And this was during the pandemic, so I was going down to my local public library and I shared my research document with a librarian there. And she helped me just kind of like batch them out. Everything they didn't have there, she got on interlibrary loan. So periodically I would just go down there, get a huge, crate of books, haul it home, go through it. They were amazing. This research librarian just kind of like lifted the limits on interlibrary loan and helped me work my way through these hundreds and hundreds of sources.
Let's take a moment and sing the praises of librarians and how often very much unsung heroes for books of this nature. So, what was that dynamic like as you were doing that kind of work?
That was such a godsend. She was amazing. And she's somebody who's very she's like not emotional, not overly smiley. And it's someone I saw really regularly through the writing of this book and putting it together. And I would just sort of like fly into these like ecstasies of, oh my God, I can't believe I have this. I can't believe I'm holding this. She got microfilm from the Library of Congress, which I guess is something Providence Public Library has not always been able to do, but she pulled it off. So she really made this possible in the most kind of like sensible, like, just like she was doing her job, like it was no big deal at all.
Mm.
So yeah, the public library made this book possible.
And when you've got enough research down, it almost feels like it never stops. Somehow
Hmm.
you have to turn it off. I don't know how, but sometimes you gotta at some point or another. When did you know you were ready to write?
That's a great question. I think I started pretty late in the process because I wanted to get the structure into slightly better shape first. And I also there's been so much written about the birth control movement. There's so much scholarship around it. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just, I don't know, like focusing on Dennett. I think what helps is when you start finding the same story told in multiple other sources, and you could see the discrepancies between those other retellings, and you start to have an opinion of your own, or see, oh, but this person has the most solid sourcing, or a citation that clearly shows that testimony was given on X day. So these other interpretations, seem to be a little looser. So that started happening. And that gave me confidence to think, okay, at least I have the beats of when things happened and I can build up the kind of personal narrative around there, see what letters were sent when and what diary entries were set down when, in terms of like what was happening with the movement, what was going on with their lobbying meetings, and what was happening with the two characters personally.
I like that idea of you start to see where the blocks are starting to and the beats are starting to reveal themselves. And in conversations I've had with other reporters, and this came more from more contemporaneous biography, but they, one guy I spoke to, he said the arc of the story revealed itself a lot through a lot of his interviews. And
Mm.
for me, it was mainly the archives. I saw what was newspaper archives and just like, oh, here's a thing that's covered very much extensively. Okay, now can I zero in on the principal characters and the principal people involved in those beats? And just for you in the course of your research, how does the narrative structure start to reveal itself?
That was really challenging. And I worked with an editor who actually he did like the first edit on Citizen Reporters also. And this one, he's someone I worked with in a publishing company like years ago, maybe like more than 10 years ago. And he's just very gifted when it comes to structure. So he very kindly read my manuscript and said, "Oh, I can see why you're trying to put the story together this way." It was like a 6 or 8 part book. I don't know why there were so many parts to it, but it wasn't especially long. It just had all these like the themes. I decided there were 6 main themes and I needed to like contain them each and put them in the sequence. And he said, I really think there should just be three. You give your background on your characters, essentially. You have the peak of their rivalry and of when the movement was most active. And Dennett kind of flames out in 1923. She leaves Congress. No, it's 1924. She stops her lobbying campaign in Congress. She is fully burnt out. She's in so much debt. And she writes to Margaret Sanger and says, the field is yours. She, on a gut level, she didn't absolutely mean it because she continued to send Sanger letters saying, I actually think you should do your work this way. She was very kind of rigid and unyielding and had no sense that Sanger was getting increasingly riled up by this letter writing campaign. And her main point of contention was that Sanger wanted to legalize birth control only through doctor's prescription, whereas Dennett wanted to fully delete the prohibition on birth control from the Comstock Act, which would have made it a more FDA style approval process for contraceptives. And it would have put them on the market for anybody to order by mail, for nurses and social workers to be able to fit diaphragms as well as doctors. She had that kind of scenario in mind because she thought it would be more equitable to poor and rural women. But Sanger was, I think she was truly pragmatic and said the doctor's only provision was to create an alliance with the medical establishment to get them to support the bill. And sure enough, she really had a lot of them on her side by the time she was in Congress, in lobbying members of Congress in the early 30s. But Dennett never stopped sending her notes saying, I know deep down you feel the same way I do. I know deep down you're the same old radical Margaret Sanger. So the last portion of the book is really after they go their separate ways. What happens when birth control actually is, when the doctor's only path is taken out of Congress, when Sanger quits lobbying and makes this incredibly fateful decision to take it into the courts. She orchestrates a test case where a bunch of diaphragms being shipped over from Japan were confiscated. And the case has a great title. It's U.S. versus one package of Japanese pessaries. And that verdict essentially opened up a path for doctors to be able to legally prescribe birth control, really for any reason. Beforehand, in some states, it had been possible only for the prevention or the cure of disease. But after 1936, after that point, doctors were able to just use their discretion and prescribe birth control whenever they thought it was possible. Now, it was another 30 years. Yeah, it was 1965 when all married Americans got access to birth control, regardless of whether a doctor thought it was appropriate or not. If somebody wanted it, then they could get it, and they were married. In 1972, the unmarried got access to that right as well. So it was the beginning of a long road to opening up access to birth control. And I did want to, I think that structure made it make a lot more sense, both to readers, but also to myself.
And backing up a little bit with just the world building around this book, I think it kind of rewinding the tape back to what the Comstock Act is. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that sets the world building in motion that you have here.
Yes, the Comstock Act is being talked about in the news today, of course, because it's still in the books. It just hasn't been enforced for many years. And it is part of Project 2025 to revive it, and begin enforcing it. So, what is the Comstock Act? In 1873, a fanatical social purity crusader named Anthony Comstock went to Washington with a bill that forbade the circulation through the US mail of anything having to do with sex, with nudity, birth control, abortion. He said his main intention was to stem the tide of pornography that was going through the mail. He was a vice agent in New York City, and according to him, these vast quantities of pornography were just flooding the mail system. At that time, his legislation it wasn't like universally popular, but Congress had a few scandals going on, and it was convenient for the members of Congress to have a way to look very morally upstanding, to pass something that showed they cared about children, they cared about right and wrong, and were upright Christian citizens. So the Comstock Act is signed into law in 1873. And of course, abortion has been happening as long as the family itself has been around, same with birth control. And the market had to find a way to navigate the Comstock Act. So people start using very euphemistic terms when they're selling contraceptives, where they might have said like a shield or a protector. Now they call them, a uterine elevator. Maybe a diaphragm or a pessary would be pitched as something to help a woman with prolapse, which is a very common condition after childbirth. And the same with condoms. They would just be billed as rubber goods, although Comstock knew enough to come down on that pretty hard. He ended up with extensive powers over the US mail. And because of his crusade, it was impossible for people to just send around anything having to do with birth control, abortion information, or devices relating to birth control and abortion were forbidden from going through the mail. And the same with sex education, where there had been a steady industry of marriage guides. These occasionally fell under Comstock's eye. Even just basic diagrams or drawings of the human body were considered overly informative, inappropriate, a bad influence. He was mocked during his time for censoring artwork and for thinking that museums ought to cover up various parts of paintings and sculptures. And so, as the birth control movement was coming into being, Sanger was much more comfortable with violating the Comstock Act and going to court because she saw each of these appearances as an opportunity for publicity. Dennett was much more convinced that the way to change the law was to work within it, was to argue, to persuade. That's why she is the idealist of the title, because she very much thought that systems would work for her if she behaved well enough within them. The other part of the world building I got really into was just the effects of this time on culture generally, on what was happening in fiction and theater and popular culture and youth culture. How did it change sex? How did it change the use of birth control when young people were unchaperoned in movie theaters and cars for the first time, and when society was increasingly urbanized, when the deaths of World War I kind of became evident across the world, when the ravages of STIs during World War I, of gonorrhea and syphilis, became common knowledge in the US. There were just a range of factors of things happening in health and in culture that I think enabled the birth control to kind of flame up, to become this uprising in the early 1920s. But they also had to strain against this tide of tradition of an all male government and just this taboo against sex and reproduction. It was considered so wildly inappropriate for reproduction to be talked about in the halls of power. And to know that it was Mary Ware Dennett who raised it for the first time, it's something we haven't really stopped talking about in politics since then. It was just so remarkable to me that her story isn't more widely known.
Yeah, and to the point of world building too, and just this idea of just trying of reducing family size and the burden of that. Again, the chapter "Women Rebels." I believe Sanger wrote this. She was like, but it's far more sordid to find yourself several years later burdened down with half a dozen unwished for children, helpless, starved, shoddily clothed, dragging at your skirt, yourself a dragged out shadow of the woman you once were. And it was just like, that really paints a picture of the desperation so many women were living under at that time.
Yes, yeah. I think she published an entire book of letters that women had written to her asking for help and explaining their personal situations. And it is heartbreaking. Their own fertility was so far out of their hands that many women would be having a baby on a near annual basis. And Sanger saw this with her own mother, which must have had a really powerful influence on her. Her mother gave birth to 11 children. Sanger was the sixth of these 11 surviving children, but she had at least 7 miscarriages as well. So she was either pregnant or breastfeeding for the majority of her roughly 30 years of marriage. Through all of that, she had tuberculosis. And Sanger has a really poignant memory of her not being able to stand up because her coughing fits were so violent. She would start coughing and find a wall to lean herself against till it was over. And then she died when she was 50. Sanger came home to nurse her when she was just out of school, and then had to stay on to help her father and raise her younger siblings.
At what point does the rivalry really start to take root?
Yeah, I think that there are 2 big factors. There's the difference in their personalities and how they got under each other's skin just on a personal level. And then their total disagreement when it came to policy. So Sanger and Dennett met probably at this secretive feminist club called Heterodoxy. Dennett was a member of this club in Greenwich Village in the early 1910s, just after she moved to New York. And Sanger came in 1914 to give a lecture on birth control. And from Sanger's perspective, the lecture had not gone well. She didn't think these kind of elite feminists were all that sympathetic to the impact that birth control could have on working class women. She thought they were probably more concerned with whether they should keep their last name after marriage and, kind of out of touch issues like that. But Dennett was fascinated, and she went and she approached Sanger. They went and lunched together at Dennett's apartment, and this, they had a friendship and a meeting of the minds. Dennett really felt a sense of belonging in the birth control movement after being introduced to it by Sanger. Just after this super promising beginning, Sanger had to flee the country because a magazine that she had released was held up by vice agents, and she was being arrested. She needed to be tried under the Comstock Act for circulating obscene material. Instead of standing trial, Sanger decided to leave and try to do her work from overseas. She didn't want to be silenced in prison. And during that time, Dennett, with a group of others, launched the first national advocacy organization for birth control, the National Birth Control League. I think it probably had irked Sanger that this league got started in her absence, although, I think she had also assumed that they were her partisans, that they were there as her allies. And they were all friends of Margaret Sanger. But when Sanger returned to face the music, she decided to stand trial after all, and that her work was too valuable. She wasn't effectively doing it overseas, so she might as well come back and see what was going to happen to her. She came to Dennett and asked for the League's support. And I really think this meeting is where things went wrong for the two of them, because Dennett, I'm not sure what her exact words were, but in Sanger's report told her that she had not approved of the way Sanger went about her work, of her readiness to break the law. She said, this league intends to work within the law, and we can't support you if you continue working in the way you are. They didn't offer her any money to help with her legal defense. And instead, then it kind of ushered her to the door while saying, by the way, if you can share any lists of donors or people who might be useful to this birth control league, I'd really appreciate it. So this moment of deep offense, of deep hurt against Sanger was something that Sanger kept close to her for a long time. Then, of course, there's their policy difference in that Dennett really thought the prohibition on birth control ought to just be stripped from the Comstock Act and free up that information. It was very much a freedom of speech argument. Free up the ability of information and devices relating to birth control so that anyone in the US would be able to get it via mail order at their local health clinic, at their drugstore. Sanger, who had initially been on the had the same vision, very much shifted in 1918 to this doctors only strategy. She thought it had a better chance of success because they wouldn't be alienating the medical establishment, and they needed something on their side. Already the whole political, legal, medical establishment was set against the idea of birth control. So I really see this, Dennett was more educated than Sanger. Sanger never finished her education. She just had a few years of nursing school. Dennett had been a professor of art and design and really had lived in the realm of ideas and art and craft before her own embrace of activism after her divorce. So I think there was this personal incompatibility, and then it was just compounded by the fact that their policies could not be brought together at all either.
Yeah, there's a moment where Dennett writes that, but of Sanger, but her English and her facts that aren't facts and her logic that isn't logic and her amazing faculty for being the whole movement. And
right.
You get a sense of the degree to which she viewed Sanger as kind of less than in that regard.
Exactly. And she really looked down on Sanger had this gift for turning herself into the central martyr heroine of the movement. I think she was really savvy. She knew people needed a leader to believe in, a person to be their surrogate and to kind of be the one they could root for. Dennett very much wanted to take herself out of it. She wanted the policies and the ideas to speak for themselves. And she was so persnickety, and almost pedantic in the way she looked at Sanger and said, well, that's not quite right. That's not quite right. There she is, grandstanding again, letting her ambition run away with her. But actually, Sanger, I think she found a lot more success because she was so much better funded, but also because she could be a hero for people.
Yeah, it just goes to show how you need like a charismatic figurehead to move the levers forward, and that, or at least to have levers pulled, and that could move things backwards or forwards. But it's like people need that kind of cult of personality as much as you would like to think that the content will carry the day. It usually needs someone, a charismatic megafauna at the head of anything.
No, that was so much Dennett's mistake. She really thought the content should carry the day. When her colleagues suggested, putting her name on her league letterhead, saying, directed by Mary Ware Dennett, she vetoed the idea. She said, I don't have anything to do with it. My name shouldn't be on there. They should support us because they believe in these principles and these ideas. But the fact is that movements need a hero. They need a charismatic personality that people can root for.
As they split and Sanger grows more influential and Dennett kind of falls off, you write later in the book that why Dennett wondered, was it so necessary for Sanger not only to ignore her efforts but torpedo them too?
Mm-hmm.
And just give us a sense of like that moment of the rivalry is such that Sanger would, as you're right, like torpedo Dennett's efforts as well.
Yeah, it was so there are unsavory elements to Sanger's career, and there's her embrace of eugenics, of course. But this, to see how consistently I honestly think she had been so irked by Dennett's disloyalty early on when Sanger was freshly back from her exile in Europe and looking for support. And that sense of disloyalty, that this is somebody who was critical of her, who had not kind of pledged fealty to her, that made her a permanent enemy. And eventually Sanger was in a position of much more power. Her second husband was hugely wealthy, and he helped Sanger run national birth control conferences and lead a propaganda campaign and eventually a lobbying campaign as well. And Sanger turned those resources to the work of expanding birth control access and information and stirring up support for a lobbying campaign. But she would also, if somebody came along who crossed her, she also did what she could to alienate them and make them feel it.
Yeah, and early on in the book too, and this kind of piggybacks on the idea of eugenics and how Sanger kind of really kind of glommed onto that idea. Is, let's see, where is it in my notes? Oh yeah, like in Naughty Pamphlets chapter, or earlier on, is like, and in all this talk of about fitness, social burdens, and preservation of the race, the birth control movement began to see an opportunity. And so take us to that moment and how this idea of fitness and race and eugenics feed into the early part of this movement.
That was important because up till then, right, birth control was part of feminism. And feminism really didn't have any traction at all in Congress or, even really in the press. It was kind of this sideshow. Eugenics gave people a way to talk about sex and birth control with this like quasi-scientific gloss. So it made it drawing room conversation, and it made birth control kind of manly, something that, men could talk about as mattering to society at large and not just to individual women who were not really seen as, as important at that time, and arguably still are not. So I think that, one thing that came out again and again as I was writing the book is that these the feminist humanitarian argument for birth control really didn't hold any water, and is still kind of hard to use as a persuasive tool when it comes to arguments that have succeeded in the government and Congress. But when there's an economic or a eugenics-based argument, people seem to get a lot more excited about that if they were a congressman or if they were the president.
Yeah, it was like this Trojan horse.
That's why birth control and eugenics, yes, it was a Trojan horse, exactly. So but the dynamic was very much that Sanger and Dennett would approach leaders in the eugenics movement saying, hey, we can work together here. And eugenicists were very wary of them because feminism really didn't have a place in their agenda at all. It was more of an Aryanization, eradication of disability. And part of the way that Sanger and Dennett could package and almost sell birth control to eugenics supporters was that it could be a tool for that. But it was never as popular an idea with them as straight out sterilization, compulsory sterilization of any population deemed unfit. I should also add that Dennett was always much less excited about eugenics, and I think she saw earlier on that this was not a movement that was friendly to feminists. So after a few kind of casual or kind of less direct approaches to movements in the to leaders in the eugenics movement, she dropped it. Sanger kind of kept on becoming more implicated and more involved. And she did make herself a pro eugenics mouthpiece, speaking about how birth control could help eradicate disability from the population. It's also been said a lot about her that she was a white supremacist and that she had an anti-Black agenda. And I never found any evidence of that when I was actually in her papers. Her focus was fully on disability when she was on her eugenics bandstand.
Yeah, and Dennett, she wrote, just her idea of just really progressive and a more civilized way of talking about things. Like just for a fair society, she wrote that, she wanted economic independence for women, the end of every type of privilege, and safe, reliable contraception. And I don't think anybody would. Well, there are plenty of people nowadays who would disagree with that, probably on all three things. But I look at that and be like, wow, that is so forward thinking and I guess sadly idealistic even today, unfortunately.
There's something so timeless about it, about this concept of what it is to have full citizenship. And she had that feminist manifesto, I think from 1916, where she just wrote, women are people, and that's really as simple as it is. It should have the same, the early part of her career was so focused on suffrage. So first, what should a citizen who's an American, what should they be able to do? Well, to vote, they shouldn't enter into this world feeling like there are others who are privileged above them for totally arbitrary reasons of wealth or race or sex. So there's that. And then there's what happens within your own body, this concept of bodily autonomy. But that also was so new when she was starting her work. And that was really interesting to parse, just that transition from even judges in some of Margaret Sanger's earliest cases saying, no, women don't have the right to enjoy sex or intercourse uncoupled from the risk of conception. That's not a thing. Sex is for the intention of conception only, especially for women. They should not be having sex without the express intent to conceive. And then 20 years later, in pop culture, sex is absolutely its own thing. The pre-code films and the Roaring Twenties and the heyday of Mae West, that transition absolutely happens over the course of the timeline in the book. That was so interesting to read through.
To what extent would you say their rivalry stunted or held the movement back?
It definitely did. Yeah, because who wins when there's a movement that's so divided and the leaders are preoccupied with the critique of the other person? It really depletes valuable energy that could be supporting the movement, that could be moving it forward. It was such a distraction because people would write in and ask, why are there two birth control leagues? Why do I need to choose? And I don't know where to send my money. There really could have been an advantage to them, even if they couldn't work together, find ways to work in complementary ways to each other. I know Dennett had a vision of that earlier on, where she would be in charge of the political lobbying and Sanger would build out a network of birth control clinics across the nation. But that seemed, finding out what I discovered about their personalities really made me think that was a little upside down. That if anyone should be lobbying and be the public figure for the movement, it was going to be Sanger. And Dennett had this incredible practical ability and like incredible wells of energy also. She just kept going back. She kept going back to Congress even when it was so hostile and when she had very few resources of her own. And, she also could have found a way to maybe not to badger Sanger quite so relentlessly, to find some other way to support the movement. Eventually, later on, even Dennett's colleagues and the people who worked for her suggested, you could build a bridge. Like maybe we could find a way so that there is just one unified movement and we could pass this. Maybe you could accept the doctor's only clause if we managed to work something in about nurses or social workers. If it maybe it wouldn't be so narrow, but maybe we could at least talk about this and see about making it happen. And Dennett was incredibly uncompromising and rejected anyone else's version of her original vision. So I think if she had been just a little less rigid, if Sanger hadn't been so focused on loyalty and clung so tight to the grudge that she held against Dennett, it would have really been advantageous to the movement. I don't know if it would have changed the culture any faster, but at least there wouldn't have been the distraction and the division that stayed with it through both of their careers.
Yeah, they strike me as the perfect pairing. One was okay being the figurehead, one wanted to be behind the scenes, and if they could have just found some some
Right,
common ground to move it
right.
forward, they seem like the perfect combo.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think Sanger from early on was aware that she could be the mouthpiece for this movement. So, there were a couple of occasions, even really early on, like when she opened the first birth control clinic in the US in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and it was open for maybe like 9 days before it was shut down. And in the she worked on it. She worked there with her sister, and her sister, when she was in prison, decided to go on a hunger strike and won an incredible amount of publicity for that. Sanger had very mixed feelings about her sister's sudden fame,
Hmm.
and their relationship took a really long time to go back to a familial, close relationship because of that. Because she had briefly eclipsed Sanger
Yeah.
as the most famous person or the person who had the headlines in the birth control movement. And then there was, even around the same time, Sanger produced this pamphlet called Family Limitation. And she printed an incredible number of these pamphlets herself to kind of flood the market with them. This became the booklet, the resource about birth control that neighbors passed to each other, that was circulated by any business that worked in the space. And as it turned out, Sanger had scooped some of the information in that booklet from another activist, Caroline Nelson, this Danish American birth control activist. And Nelson, who had been friendly with Sanger, was just crestfallen and felt betrayed and, became very close to Dennett later on because of that.
It's one of those things where no one having that notion of a rising tide floats all boats. It seemed very
Mm-hmm.
much like, well, to the torpedoing metaphor. It's just like Sanger. It's just like she just needed to fucking go nuclear on
Yeah.
everyone around her.
Yeah, and she had such a platform too. Her magazine, the Birth Control Review, had a wide circulation, and she was also her name was recognizable pretty early on, and so she could write op-eds and publish them. And when 1930 came along and birth control was kind of much more a publishable, debatable, popular topic, she managed to get a whole issue of The Nation magazine devoted to birth control. And when the editor accepted an article by Dennett, Sanger just quietly went along and had it nixed, just had it thrown out right before
Oh my
publication
God.
because she did not want to give anybody else a platform. It was hers.
Oh my God. I know. Oh my gosh. It's just, you almost see so much of just even that degree of platforming and politicking. You just see it kind of today with social media and podcasting and everything,
Mm-hmm.
like who's verified, who gets more voice over the others. It's just the ethos of it. It's the
Yes.
same, but the technology has changed.
Yeah.
Well, Stephanie, as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I've long asked people, I kind of got away from it, but I want to come back to it, of asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind. And if it gets you a little flat-footed, I'm sorry.
No,
But
no.
I love asking guests
Um,
for just whatever is kind of exciting you these days.
yeah, something that's really exciting me is I've started reading fiction again, and fiction, maybe like older novels plus new releases. Right now, I'm reading Other People's Houses by Laurie Siegel, which is it's based on her life. It is a novel, but it's based on her experiences starting when she was 10 years old and it being transplanted from Austria to England just before the start of the Second World War, and it's this voice from another time that after you've been immersed in nonfiction for so long, you kind of forget how fiction can sweep you away and just the possibilities that are there. I love writing nonfiction myself, and I think there's an incredible creativity that's possible when you have that restriction of not making things up. But to lose yourself in a novel, especially, I'll wake up in the wee hours and instead of looking at the news, actually open the book and get something out of the night. It's so rewarding. It's amazing because I could never write that kind of book myself, and it's a connection to just, I don't know, these people who are from a different country or from a culture that maybe doesn't make so much sense to me, but you have that like, oh, we are truly, it's so cheesy to say, but so much more connected than not. Fiction does that in a way that I had lost touch with and have really been loving rediscovering.
Why do you think you would be incapable of writing fiction?
I don't think I'd be incapable of writing fiction, just, good fiction.
Right.
It's
So
it's
there's a
it's
distinction.
that yes. It is that world building and that full kind of being able to put yourself in the voice of another person. I don't know. What do you think? Have you ever done it?
Any kind of like you, I've dabbled, and anytime I feel like I just I like outsourcing a lot of the dialogue and the world building to things that have actually happened, and I'm just like kind of aggregating all this stuff from stuff that has actually happened. I have no faith in my
Mm,
imagination when it comes to that stuff and making like real
yes.
cracking dialogue and stuff like that. Like, you
Yes.
know what? It like that's kind of how I feel. And often when I've written some fiction, especially if it starts to get close to me, I'm like, well, why don't I just make this nonfiction? And
Right.
I
Yeah.
just I will start fiction and it starts slouching towards nonfiction, and I'm just like, okay, well, here we are. Like I tried to novelize this baseball memoir that I wrote that's in the drawer, and as I was retyping the entire manuscript, it just basically just stayed nonfiction. As much as I
Mm,
tried to fictionalize it, it would just remain nonfiction. I'm like, all right, well, this is the lane I'm
yeah.
in. I might as well not not
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. I think there's also such a motivation with nonfiction. Like, I'll find a story or I'll find a person or a relationship, a movement, and think, oh, I really want to talk to people about this. I would love a book about this. So I'm going to try and write one, for myself and other interested people. And nothing from my imagination has come close to making me think that, like, oh, people need to know about this.
Yeah.
Like, they really don't.
Yeah. And another thing, too is, and this will sound really weird, but like when I write fiction, it just feels too fake. I want it to be grounded in things that are verifiably true, because that really lights me up. And like when I read a really great magazine story or a great essay that like maybe a personal or reported essay that has first person narration, but it really looks more outward. And I'm like, oh wow, the fact that this happened and it's being filtered through like a real, I don't know, just grounded in actual reality. In fact, to me, that just lights me up in a way. But I love fiction because I'll read fiction and be like, oh, I see what they're doing there. In what ways might I be able to pull that off by interviewing the right people, finding the right people, intersecting with them at a moment of action and conflict it lights me up in a way that it doesn't feel contrived. Like I'm like, oh wow, that happened, and that's part of the juice for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree.
Fantastic.
And like,
awesome, Stephanie. This is great. I'm so glad we got to talk again on the mics about your wonderful new book. And just thanks for carving out the time and for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Brendan. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Sweet. Awesome. Thanks to Stephanie. And thanks to you, kind listener. Name of the book again is The Icon and the Idealist, Margaret Sanger, Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry that brought birth control to America. Thanks also to the Power of Narrative Conference for promotional support. Visit combeyond.bu.edu. Find the Power of Narrative Conference tab. You know how to use the internet, a mouse, a cursor, and use the CNF 15 code for 15% off your registration fee. And hey, maybe consider ordering a copy or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of The Front Runner. Which brings us to the end of the year. This is the final podcast of 2024, which is crazy. It's fucking crazy. I don't know what can be said about 2024. The year started with a mad dash toward finishing The Front Runner. Initial deadline being April 15th. Then it took the better part of 7 months to shape it into its current final form. It went from a draft of 160,000 words to 105,000. I was 6 for 6 with people I want to blurb the book. I had a couple Pulitzer Prize winners, all of them bestsellers, just titans of the genre. All of them previous guests on the show, a part of this growing community of brilliant nonfiction writers, past, present, and future. I'll riff about asking for blurbs another time and how I think I was effective in doing it. So what were some of the key lessons from the Prefontaine book? Like, what's the game tape telling me about this book so I can be better prepared for the next one, to make the process better, to write a better book, subjective as that is. And I'm not sure to what extent this is wholly fleshed out. This is just something that kind of came to the top of my mind, but I imagine there will be other threads or lessons to pull on. But in writing this little script, this is what kind of came to mind. I think I could have been a little more rigorous with making phone calls. I conducted hundreds of interviews and placed many more calls, but I can't shake the feeling I could have done more. I'm still confused about how best to find the shape of the thing. Ian O'Connor said on the show, he finds the shape of his book through the interviewing process. I found the shape of this Prefontaine book through the archives, as the most rigorously covered material proved to be the most significant tentpole moments of the book. And then I drilled down on the people involved in those moments, ancillary people, not just the big names, to bring more detail to the forefront. How do you find the arc? What is the story you're hoping to tell? Is that the starting point, or does that reveal itself through the reporting? I learned you need to make assertions. You need to be confident in pointing out what matters. How it, and even not necessarily using the first person, but having the assertion of a first person narrator, even though that pronoun doesn't come in. You very much know what I'm telling you is important. You need to be confident in pointing out what matters, how it informs the biography you're looking to tell. That's not speculating or putting thoughts into their head, but you can call out a figure if they're being a dick. Or, if you've read thousands of articles and conducted hundreds of interviews, you can be certain you're somewhat of an expert. You might even know the person better than many because you've triangulated it from so many sources. Everyone has a slice of that person. And the biographer, by speaking with so many people, assembles the deconstructed life into something cogent. Something I regret, and I knew it was happening in the moment, but was powerless to steer the cruise ship of my mind, was this idea of not having enough time to do it. I desperately wanted 6 more months or a year. I just didn't have the time. Sure, I had plenty, I did have a contracted timeline. And but had I not fretted about it, just kind of like, okay, you're dealing with a shorter runway than is ideal. What are you going to do about it? I think I could have accomplished more. I could have bought access to an extra newspaper archive that I just neglected. It just missed my attention. I'm upset that I missed this one particular Oregonian archive. And I could have maybe found that extra bit of seasoning that elevates the entire dish, I wish I had done a bit more in-person things. I made only one true reporting trip to Coos Bay, though I've been to Coos Bay a bunch of times. Only one true reporting trip to meet with a woman, Fran Worthen, who drove me around town, drove me around the running routes. And I did stand on the track, and I tried to imagine the scene. Above all, I wish I had a clearer sense of the story I wanted to tell from the start. To this day, I'm not entirely sure I nailed it. What's the lens through which we're re-examining his life? These were questions that were posed at the very outset of the book proposal process, and I didn't have an answer that was, let's lay out a detailed view of his life and let the reader feel the vibrancy of this life shortchanged by one bad decision. So much of his life and his appeal can't be articulated. So many people have tried, and they just can't. It just was. He looms over track and field the way Michael Jordan looms over the NBA or Tiger Woods looms over golf. It's timing, it's luck, and it can never be rebottled. Every sport tries to recapture the magic of those figures who fundamentally change the course of the sport. Fact is, there will never be another Michael Jordan or Woods or Prefontaine. The sport was ready to change, and they came of age at a time of change that was more cosmic than contrived. These are some of my talking points that I didn't necessarily thread into the epilogue. Well, they kind of did, but a sport will drive itself insane trying to find the next thing, and all that does is devalue everyone who comes after. So all we can do is celebrate what was through rigor and research and showing, not telling just why it is they tower so tall. So, man, 2025 is going to be fucking insane. Truly insane. And you're along the ride. You're coming along the ride, man, whether you like it or not. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.